Babylon in a Fire. Episode 2, Blood Pondy Bible. Previously, Episode 1, Speaker Boxes and Serpents. Before we go forward, we must go back. Back to the Crescent Pen District, that crescent of land pressed between the Blue Mountains and the sea, where the roads are narrow and the memories are long, and the people have learned to carry both joy and sorrow in the same two hands. Back to New Jerusalem Tabernacle, where the Word of God was spoken on Sunday mornings with such conviction that the zinc roof rattled, and where, beneath that rattling, beneath the hallelujahs and the tambourines, something else entirely was being conducted. Back to Detective Corporal Nikki Campbell, Nikki to those who loved her, Corporal to those who feared her, and to one man now sitting in a detention cell, something far less printable than either. Nikki, who had walked into New Jerusalem Tabernacle not looking for God, but for guns, and found both, in a manner of speaking. The guns were in the speaker boxes shipped from Miami. The God was in the courage of a 19-year-old girl named Kezia, granddaughter of Brother Marcus Tafari, who stood up and told the truth when every force around her was screaming for her silence. Back to Pastor Conrad Levy, beloved, broad-shouldered, baritone-voiced Conrad Levy, who could make you weep with scripture and could also, it turned out, make a man disappear with a phone call. Back to Councillor Drummond, law and order politician, whose law and order had a price tag attached, paid in the currency of the ganja trade. Back to Superintendent Rohan Bent, who had served the Jamaica Constabulary Force for 22 years, and had spent 17 of those years being very carefully, very quietly, very profitably dishonest. And back to Cecil Pinky Brown, who knew too much and said too little and died for the gap between those two facts, shot down at the Judgment Night dance event before he could say the name that was on the tip of his tongue. His blood on the ground of that dance. His silence an inheritance to those who killed him. Nikki reached out to the anti-corruption unit at the end of that long night. A hand extended into the dark, not knowing whose hand would reach back. Her partner, Detective Constable Fabian Morris, Fabe, 29 years old and brave in ways that hadn't cost him enough yet, was beaten behind that same dance event. He survived. The case cracked open like a coconut on concrete. But a cracked open case and a closed case are two very different things. And in Crescent Pen, in Jamaica, on this island of sun and shadow and complicated grace, nothing is ever truly over when you think it is. This is Episode 2. This is Blood Pondy Bible. Crescent Pen wakes up wrong. Dawn came to Crescent Pen the way bad news comes to a small community, quietly, and then all at once. The morning mist was still thick on the hills when Miss Gloria opened her parlor at 5:30, the way she had opened it every morning for 31 years. Pulling back the wooden shutters and setting out the hard dough bread and the tin of sardines and the boiling pot of chocolate tea that she would pour for whoever came first. But this morning, Miss Gloria paused before she did any of that. She stood at her shutters and looked out at the empty street and felt something that she could not quite name, but would later describe, to anyone who would listen, as dread. The word had spread the way it always spreads in communities like Crescent Pen, not through newspapers, not through official announcements, but through the mouths of people who had been there, or knew someone who had been there, or lived next door to someone whose cousin had seen it with their own eyes. What had happened at Judgment Night? What Kezia had said? What Superintendent Bent had done? What Nikki had uncovered inside those speaker boxes, those heavy, innocuous, God-fearing speaker boxes that had carried a congregation's praise and a smuggler's cargo at the same time. By 6 in the morning, the street in front of New Jerusalem Tabernacle was not empty. It was not crowded either. It was occupied, in that particular Jamaican way, by a handful of people who were not quite doing anything but were very clearly there. 2 older men sitting on the concrete wall across the road, arms folded, watching. 3 women from the Mothers' Union standing in a cluster on the corner, heads inclined toward each other, voices low. A teenage boy on a bicycle who rode past the church gate twice and then a third time, slower looking. The gate of New Jerusalem Tabernacle was locked. The padlock on it was the color of old blood in the early morning light. The church itself sat silent behind its own fence, the painted words "God is love" still bright on the front wall, still cheerful, still entirely oblivious to the scandal that had attached itself to the building like a second skin. Inside Miss Gloria's parlor, by 7 o'clock, the radio was on. Island Morning with Fitzroy. The most listened to morning show in the parish. Fitzroy, no last name necessary. The way only the truly beloved can shed their surnames, had a voice like warm molasses and a talent for making his listeners feel that they were all sitting together in the same yard, sharing the same cup of tea. This morning, Fitzroy was grave. He spoke carefully. He said that disturbing allegations had emerged from the Crescent Pen area. He said that investigations were ongoing. He said that no one should rush to judgment. And then, because Fitzroy was a man who knew his audience and knew his moment, he said that he had reached out to Pastor Conrad Levy for comment, and that Pastor Levy had agreed to speak to the nation. Miss Gloria turned up the radio. So did every other parlor, every minibus, every yard within earshot of Crescent Pen. The voice that came through the speaker over phone, slightly compressed, but unmistakably his, that baritone built for benediction, was composed. It was grieved. It was, above all, convincing. Levy spoke of being a servant of God for 37 years. He spoke of the lives he had lifted, the youth he had mentored, the funerals he had presided over, the babies he had christened in that very church. He spoke of enemies, not naming them, but the implication clear enough, who wished to tear down what God had built. He used the word persecution 3 times. He quoted Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He said that the truth would come out, and that when it did, the faithful would know that their shepherd had never wavered. He did not deny the speaker boxes. He did not have to. By the time Fitzroy said, "Pastor, we thank you for your courage in speaking out this morning," the damage that Levy intended to inflict had already been done. Not damage to his accusers, not yet, not entirely. But the seeds of doubt, scattered into the soil of a community that wanted so very badly to believe that the man who had baptized their children was not capable of what he was being accused of. Seeds. They grow in darkness and in light both. Scene 2. Nikki meets her equal. The anti-corruption unit office was not in Kingston proper. It occupied a building in a commercial stretch that looked, deliberately, like nothing important, a pale concrete structure behind a modest gate, the signage small and institutional. Inside, the air conditioning worked better than anywhere else. Nikki had been in a government building, which she noted with the dry appreciation of a woman who had spent too many years in sweat-soaked offices with ceiling fans that rattled. She had driven 2 hours that morning, leaving Crescent Pen before the radio came on, the case files and the USB drive with copied evidence on the seat beside her, her hands steady on the wheel in a way that her insides were not. She had not slept. Not properly. She had sat at her kitchen table until 3 in the morning going over the same pages, the same figures, the same names, drawing lines between them in pencil that she then erased and redrew. She had eaten half a tin of crackers and drunk 4 cups of coffee, and by the time she stood in the ACU reception area, she was running on something that was not quite adrenaline and not quite faith, but lived in the territory between them. Inspector Claudette Samuels came out of an inner office, and Nikki understood immediately why people called her Claude and nothing warmer than that. She was perhaps 40, perhaps 45, it was genuinely difficult to tell, and something about her bearing suggested she had engineered that difficulty deliberately. She was St. Elizabeth born, which meant she came from a part of Jamaica where the land is dry and the people are harder than the land, and the women especially do not suffer inefficiency in any form. She was neat. She was precise. She wore her rank the way some people wear armor, not as decoration, but as function. She looked at Nikki the way you look at a tool you have been handed, but have not yet decided whether you trust. Nikki, for her part, did not flinch. She had been looked at like that before. She had been underestimated before. The two things tended to go together, and she had learned to use the second as a consequence of the first. Claude took the files. She sat across from Nikki at a plain table with a recorder between them, and she went through the evidence with the meticulous care of someone who had seen fabricated cases and was checking to make sure this was not one of them. She asked questions. They were good questions, sharp, precise, aimed at the exact joints of the case where weakness might hide. Nikki answered them all. Some answers satisfied Claude. Some required follow-up, which Nikki provided. One answer made Claude go still for a moment, pen pausing above her notepad before she wrote something down and underlined it twice. That answer was the name Devon Hilton. And attached to it, the company name, Caribbean Sun Freight LLC. And attached to that, the first faint shape of something large and international and, if Nikki's reading of the paper trail was correct, extraordinarily dangerous. You went far with this, Claude said. Not a compliment. Not yet. An observation, delivered with the neutrality of a woman who reserves her endorsements. Nikki said that she had gone as far as the evidence took her. She said that the evidence had gone further than she expected. She said that she believed there was a layer above Levy, above Bent, above the whole network as she currently understood it, and that she did not yet know what that layer looked like, but she was becoming increasingly certain it existed. Claude listened to all of this. Then she closed the file. Then she looked at Nikki with something that was not warmth, but was the precursor to warmth, a kind of measured acknowledgement. She said that she had heard of Nikki. She said that what she had heard was mixed, which was usually how she knew someone was doing something right. She said she would assign resources. She said the ACU had reached into Miami through a joint law enforcement framework. She said she would handle Bent personally. She said she would need Nikki to stay close, stay sharp, and stay away from anything that might compromise the case before they were ready to move on it. She did not say she trusted Nikki. But she did not say she didn't. For two women who operated in a world that did not extend easy trust to anyone, that was enough to begin. Bent behind glass. They had caught Superintendent Rohan Bent at Norman Manley International Airport. He had been in line at the departure gate for the Air Canada flight to Toronto, a rolling suitcase at his side and a carry-on bag on his shoulder, and the expression of a man who has convinced himself, through sheer force of will, that he is not doing what he is doing. His ticket was purchased less than 6 hours before his arrest. His passport was valid. His bank account, the one they knew about, had been emptied in the preceding 48 hours of everything above the minimum balance required to keep it open, which is the financial equivalent of clearing your desk. He had been calm when they took him. That was the detail that unsettled people most, not that he ran, but that when he couldn't run anymore, he went so still. A calmness that was not innocence. A calmness that was something calculated and cold, the calmness of a man who has a contingency plan even for being caught, who has already decided, in the moment of arrest, that silence is both his shield and his leverage. Nikki drove past the detention facility on her way back from the ACU office. She did not stop. There was nothing to be gained from stopping. She was not the investigating officer on Bent. That was Claude's territory now, and Nikki understood that boundaries were part of what made this collaboration work. But she slowed. For just a moment, she slowed and looked at the wall of the facility, the unremarkable concrete, the razor wire at the top, and she thought about Bent sitting inside it, and she felt something complicated. Not satisfaction. She had expected satisfaction, but it was not what came. What came was something closer to grief, the specific grief of discovering that a person in authority, a person who wore the same uniform as she did and swore the same oath, had taken that oath and used it as wrapping paper for the thing he was actually doing. The grief of a betrayal that is not personal, but somehow feels it. Bent was not talking. This was confirmed by Claude in a brief text message as Nikki pulled back onto the main road. 3 words. Silence. Well-funded. Patient. Which told Nikki that someone was paying for his silence, which meant someone out there was afraid enough of what he knew to keep him quiet, which meant there was more, still more, layers below layers, and she was standing at the entrance to something with no clear bottom. She put her foot on the accelerator. The road unspooled before her. Fabe in the hospital, and a second threat. The hospital ward smelled of antiseptic and cooked food and the particular stillness of places where people are mending. Fabian Morris was in a bed by the window, which had the view of a car park and a breadfruit tree, and he seemed to be studying both of them with the careful attention of a man who has recently had cause to reassess the value of being alive and is now cataloging the world accordingly. He had 2 cracked ribs, a fractured left cheekbone, lacerations across his knuckles from where he had fought back before the second and third of them got hold of his arms. A bruise that covered most of the left side of his face like a map of somewhere painful and purple. He was 29 years old and he looked, in this moment, both younger and older than that. Nikki sat in the plastic chair beside the bed with her jacket folded across her lap. She did not fuss over him. He would not have wanted that. She brought saltfish fritters wrapped in paper from a vendor outside and set them on the bedside table, and they both pretended, for a few minutes, that this was an ordinary visit between colleagues. Then Fabe told her about the second threat. Not money this time. He said it clearly, making sure she understood the distinction. The first approach, weeks ago, had been money, an envelope slid across a table, an implication that there were things it would be better for him not to see, not to report, not to remember. He had not taken it. He had not reported it either, which was the thing he could not quite look her in the eye about as he said it, though he tried. But this time it was not money. This time it was a photograph. A photograph of his mother walking home from the market in her yellow dress, carrying her shopping bag, walking past the standpipe on the corner of her street in Portmore. A photograph taken recently. The dress was the one she wore on Saturdays. A photograph that said, without any written words necessary, we know where she walks and when, and we can reach her at any point we choose. The photograph had been left in an envelope on the seat of Fabe's car, which was parked in the hospital car park. Which meant they knew he was here. Which meant they were watching. Nikki looked at the photograph for a long time. Fabe's mother, a small woman with a wide smile and arms that could fold you into safety. A woman who sold patties at a stall on weekends and attended church on Sundays, and had raised her son alone after his father left, and had asked only that the sacrifice be worth something. Nikki knew her. Not well, but enough to know that this photograph was not just a threat. It was a very specific kind of cruelty. She asked Fabe what he wanted to do. He said that he had been lying in this bed for 3 days thinking about exactly that question. He said he had thought about what it would mean to step back, not walk away entirely, but pull back, go quiet, let the case proceed without him being visible in it. He said he had told himself, in the small hours of the hospital night when the ward was quiet and the pain in his ribs made sleep difficult, that pulling back was the smart thing, the safe thing, the right thing for his mother. And then he said that he kept coming back to Pinky, to Cecil Brown lying on the ground at Judgment Night, to the fact that Pinky had also had people who loved him, people for whom his life was the organizing principle of their own, and that those people were now without him, not because Pinky chose danger, but because danger found him anyway. Found him precisely because he had started to reach toward truth. He said, "Me not back down, Nikki. Not this time. Me rather face it looking forward than run and still get catch from behind." He turned and looked at her then, fully, The bruised face and the careful eyes and the decision made clean and permanent behind them. Nikki said she would arrange security for his mother. She said she knew people in Portmore she trusted. She said it quietly, practically, with no ceremony, because Fabe had not said what he said in order to be celebrated, and she understood that. She squeezed his hand once, briefly, before she left. Outside in the corridor, she stopped and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. Then she kept walking. Brother Marcus speaks and Tarek rises. The community gathering was held not in a church or a community center, but in the yard of a man named Desmond who had a large open space at the back of his property that was used for everything from domino tournaments to 9-night celebrations. By the time Brother Marcus arrived, there were perhaps 100 people there, seated on folding chairs, on overturned crates, on the low wall at the edge of the yard, standing in the space between, some with small children on their laps, some with arms folded and faces uncertain. Marcus Tafari was 68 years old. His locks, long and silver-streaked, were wrapped in a cloth of green and gold. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked earth for decades, thick through the knuckles, stained with the honesty of soil. He had been in a police cell 6 days ago on the basis of planted evidence. He had been exonerated because his granddaughter stood up and told the truth. He walked into Desmond's yard with the careful dignity of a man who has been through fire and declined to be ash. He did not speak with anger. This surprised some of the younger people in the yard, who had expected anger, who had perhaps hoped for it, who understood anger as the appropriate fuel for what they were feeling. But Marcus did not give them anger. He gave them something harder to use and harder to misuse. He gave them truth, spoken plainly, in the lilting cadences of a man who had grown up in these hills and understood that the hills remembered everything. He said he had been framed. He said it without drama. The way you state a weather report, this is what happened. This is the sky as it actually is. He said he had known Levy as a deacon before Levy was a pastor, and that the corruption he was seeing now was not a fall from grace, but a revelation of what had always been beneath the grace, something arranged, something strategic, something that wore the church the way a man wears a borrowed coat. He said the community deserved to know what was happening in its name, under its roof, with its trust. He said, "Dem na just wrong God. Dem wrong every one of us who ever believed." The yard was very quiet. And then it was not quiet. It was in the aftermath of that, in the buzzing, overlapping conversations, the breaking open of something that had been held in by community stoicism and communal silence, that Tarek Powell stood up. 24 years old. Tall. The kind of lean that comes from always being on the move. He wore a t-shirt with a clenched fist print and the sleeves cut off, and he had the face of someone who had made peace, recently and at some cost, with the fact that he cared about things when it would have been considerably easier not to. His past was not clean. He had been arrested twice before the age of 20, both times for minor infractions, once for being in the wrong place with the wrong company, once for something more specifically his own doing that he had spent several years since working through. He had community service hours in this very district. He knew several of the people in this yard from circumstances none of them wished to revisit. He stood up and said that knowing was not enough, that they needed to be organized, that this district needed eyes and voices that were not police, not because police were all bad, he said carefully, with the nuance of someone who had reasons to have complicated feelings on this subject, but because communities had always protected themselves best when they were themselves vigilant, themselves awake, themselves the first line of their own safety. He said he wanted to form a community watchdog group. He said he had a name for it, Crescent Pen Eyes. He said it with a slight self-consciousness, aware that names can be too grand for their moments, but the yard responded before he could second-guess himself, a rolling murmur of assent, a few voices saying yes. A woman in the back clapping twice in the rhythm that means agreement in this part of the island. Tarek sat back down. He caught Marcus's eye across the yard. Marcus nodded once, slow and deliberate, the nod of a man recognizing something useful taking root. Seeds again. Always seeds. Paper trails and ghost ships. Caribbean Sun Freight and the man in Miami. Caribbean Sun Freight LLC was incorporated in the state of Florida on the 14th of March, 11 years prior, with a registered address in Hialeah and a declared purpose of international freight logistics and Caribbean sea shipping. On paper, it was unimpeachable. The company had real clients, real contracts, real invoices. It paid real taxes, though not always on all of its real income. It had a website with stock photographs of smiling warehouse workers and a company motto in blue text that read your cargo, our commitment. Devin Devo Hilton had built it carefully. This was a man who understood that the best front is not merely a shell, but a functioning enterprise that generates enough legitimate revenue to make the illegitimate fraction invisible in the noise. He had come to Miami from Jamaica at age 19, had worked in freight and logistics in the port of Miami for a decade, had learned the mechanics of the system from the inside, the paperwork, the custom schedules, the gaps in inspection protocols, the precise weight thresholds that triggered additional scrutiny, and how to stay just beneath them. He was, by every measure that did not account for the cargo in certain sealed boxes, an entrepreneurial success story. Nikki and Claude worked the paper trail across 2 days, in a borrowed office in the ACU building with a secure computer terminal and a whiteboard that accumulated lines and arrows and circled names with the organic complexity of something growing. The company records for Caribbean Sun Freight, obtained through the joint framework Claude had activated, showed 6 shipments to Jamaica in the preceding 18 months. 4 of those shipments included speaker equipment and audio hardware. All 4 of those shipments had been manifested through the same freight broker, a company called Sunlight Audio Distribution, which existed at a postal address in Montego Bay and, upon investigation, turned out to be a name attached to a P.O. box attached to a man who had died 11 months prior. Duppy Company, Nikki said under her breath, which was not a term Claude knew but which she understood from context and context alone. Ghost Company, dead before the ink was dry. Useful only for the paper trail it provided and for the very specific way in which it ended the trail by not existing. But Nikki had learned to follow paper the way water follows a hill, not by going straight, but by finding every channel that was lower than the last. She traced the Sunlight Audio Distribution payments back through a correspondent bank account in the Cayman Islands, which traced further to a private holding company registered in Delaware, which was the corporate equivalent of a hall of mirrors. But one of the signatures on the Delaware incorporation documents was a name she knew from somewhere, a name she had seen not in the case files, but in a financial disclosure document attached to a Kingston attorney's professional registration. Carlton Vaz. She circled it on the whiteboard 3 times. She underlined it. She looked at Claude. Claude looked at the board. A silence passed between them that had the quality of a door opening onto a room that neither of them had expected to find. Devo Hilton, up in Miami, moving the cargo. Carlton Vaz in Kingston, managing the legal architecture. Pastor Levy in Crescent Pen, running the on-the-ground operation through the church network. And Superintendent Bent running interference from inside the constabulary force itself. For points on a structure. For men performing 4 very different functions for what was, at its core, a single operation. But structures have builders above them. Every column has a roof it's holding up. Claude wrote one word at the top of the board, in capital letters, and drew a question mark after it. Architect. She tapped the word. She said, whoever this is, they're not in any of these documents. They're in the silence between the documents. They're in the gap between what can be proved and what must be inferred. Finding them would require getting one of the 4 named participants to talk. And right now, 2 were hiding in public performance. One was silent in a cell, and one was in Florida. Nikki looked at the board for a long time. She was thinking about what she needed next, and where it was most likely to come from, and whether what she was about to do was safe for the person who was about to give it to her. The church was not locked that Thursday morning. The side door, the one that opened onto the narrow passage between the church and the deacon's office, was open, and the morning light came through it in a thin blade that illuminated a strip of the concrete floor and the edge of the third pew from the front. Mother Ivy Chambers was 74 years old, and she had been a member of New Jerusalem Tabernacle for 46 of those years. She had sung in the choir when the choir had a tenor who could shake the zinc roof. She had cooked for every funeral repast, every wedding breakfast, every harvest festival that the church had hosted in her time there. She had cleaned the altar cloths by hand. She had prayed in this building on her knees when her husband died, when her son emigrated and did not come back, when her grandbaby was born too small and too early and spent 3 weeks in hospital before he came home to her and grew up strong and fine. This church had held her grief and her joy in equal measure, and she had trusted it to do so the way she trusted the sun to come up, not blindly, but with the deep institutional confidence of long experience. She was sitting in the third pew from the front when Nikki came in. She did not look around. She had known, through the quiet networks that 74-year-old women who have lived their entire lives in one community know things, that Nikki was coming. She had left the side door open herself. Nikki sat in the pew behind her, not the side behind. This was deliberate on both their parts, an arrangement that allowed 2 women who could not be seen together publicly to speak in a space that looked, from any angle, like nothing more than 2 individuals in private prayer. Mother Ivy did not look at Nikki when she spoke. She looked at the altar. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her voice was barely above a murmur, low and deliberate, timed to the empty church where sound carried strangely, which meant speaking softly was the same as speaking in code. She said she had not come to Nikki because she trusted police. She said this plainly, without apology. She said that in her experience, police had been as much a source of harm in communities like hers as they had been a source of help, and that was simply the truth of her experience, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. But she said she had come because she trusted God first, and because she believed that God required her to act when wickedness was using his house as its address. She said she had known, for longer than Nikki might think, that something was not right about certain men. She said there were things she had seen, late-night meetings in the deacon's office with the door not quite closed, a man she didn't recognize who came twice and spoke with Levy in the parking lot after evening service, a delivery that came on a Tuesday in a van with no markings that was not the furniture company the deacons had said they were expecting. Small things. Things that an old woman who came to pray in the mornings would notice and say nothing about because she had not known then what they meant. She knew now. She described the unrecognized man who had come twice after evening service. Medium height, light complexioned, well-dressed, wearing a watch that caught the parking lot light. She said he had a way of standing that made her think of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. She said he was not from Crescent Pen. She said he drove a dark-colored car that she thought was foreign-made. Nikki, in the pew behind her, wrote everything down without making the writing visible. When Mother Ivy finished speaking, a silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with the things that had been said and the cost of saying them. Nikki said thank you. She said it with the specific weight of meaning it fully. Mother Ivy said, "Nah, thank me yet. Thank me when de wickedness done." Then she rose from the pew with the careful deliberateness of a woman whose knees held memories of every floor she had knelt on, and she walked toward the altar as if she had simply come to pray, which in a sense was true. Nikki sat alone in the pew for a moment longer. The church was very quiet. The blade of light from the side door had moved slightly, following the sun. She thought about what she had just heard, and what it implied, and what it would cost the woman who had told her. She promised herself, in the silence of that empty sanctuary, that she would not let it cost her more than she had already paid. The night at Miss Eula's house. Miss Eula's house was in a community 20 minutes inland from Crescent Pen, up a road that narrowed gradually until it was barely wide enough for one vehicle, and then opened again unexpectedly into a small settlement of perhaps 15 houses, a standpipe, a rum bar, and a church that held services twice weekly. It was the kind of place that people from the outside did not find easily, which was exactly why it had been chosen for Kezia. But they found her. The phone call came to Nikki's mobile at 11:47 at night, a number she did not recognize, but answered because she always answered numbers she didn't recognize, because Nikki had learned that in this work. It was the calls from unfamiliar numbers that mattered most. The voice was Miss Eula's neighbor, a young man named Devin, no relation, who had come home from his night shift at the petrol station to find his dog going frantic in the yard, and who had looked over the fence and seen a light in Eula's house where there should not have been a light, moving between rooms the wrong way. The way a light moves when someone is searching rather than when someone is simply living. Nikki was in her car in 7 minutes and driving in 8. She called Claude, who dispatched a unit from the nearest station. She called Miss Eula's house phone, which rang out. She called Kezia's mobile, which was switched off, which was either because Kezia was following the protocol she'd been given or because something had gone very wrong with the protocol. She drove the way she drove when she needed to drive, with every part of her attention on the road and another part of her attention already at the destination, already reading the scene she had not yet arrived at. The mountains on either side of the road were black shapes against a star-heavy sky. The road was empty at this hour. The headlights cut ahead of her through the darkness, and she followed them, outrunning the fear that was not quite fear, but lived in the same register. She was first on the scene by 4 minutes. The front door of Miss Eula's house was not broken. It had been opened from the inside, which meant the lock had been picked or the key had been obtained, both of which were the kind of operational detail that pointed away from opportunistic crime and toward something planned. The light Devin had seen was no longer moving. The house was dark. This was in some ways worse. Nikki went in with her weapon drawn, moving through the small house with the trained economy of a person doing something frightening and refusing to be frightened by it. The front room clear. The kitchen clear. The bathroom door open, nothing. The back bedroom door closed. She pushed the door and found 2 things at once. Miss Eula sitting on the floor beside the bed, wrists bound with electrical tape, eyes wide and furious rather than terrified, the fury of a woman who has been subjected to an indignity rather than overcome by it. And Kezia. Kezia was in the wardrobe. She had locked herself in from the inside using a piece of furniture wedged against the wardrobe door from within, which should not have been possible but was, because Kezia was a girl who had been underestimated so consistently that she had developed, as a form of self-defense, a creative and determined relationship with impossible things. The man who had come one man alone, which suggested confidence or arrogance or both, had searched the house for 12 minutes before the sound of Nikki's car outside had sent him out through the back window, leaving Miss Eula bound and the wardrobe locked and a warning written on the kitchen wall in black marker. A single sentence in all capitals that Nikki photographed and did not repeat aloud, but that said everything necessary about the depth of Levy's network's willingness to do harm. The police unit arrived 4 minutes later. Miss Eula's wrists were freed. Kezia came out of the wardrobe on her own, declining assistance, her chin high, her eyes dry. She looked at Nikki across the small room with an expression that was not asking to be saved, but was accepting, with a kind of exhausted dignity, that being saved was currently necessary, and she would manage that fact as she managed everything, by incorporating it into herself without breaking. Nikki thought, this girl is stronger than the system that is supposed to be protecting her. She thought it with the specific, complicated pride of a woman who has also, in her time, been stronger than the system around her and found it a lonely distinction. New arrangements would need to be made before morning. Nikki was already making them in her head. Councillor Drummond held her press conference at 11 in the morning in a hotel meeting room in Kingston, with a backdrop of Jamaican flags and a podium bearing the logo of her constituency office. She wore a cream-colored dress and no jewelry, which was carefully chosen, not the power dressing of her usual public appearances, but something softer, more human, more put upon. Her hair was natural. Her expression was one that had been carefully constructed to read as a strong woman finally breaking under the weight of what she has endured. She was a gifted performer. This must be said. Whatever else Yvette Drummond was, and she was many things, none of them entirely honorable, most of them considerably more complicated than either her enemies or her supporters believed. She was gifted at the management of public perception. She had built her political career on it. She understood that Jamaican voters, like voters everywhere, respond to authenticity, and she had made authenticity into a performance and performed it so consistently that the performance had become, in some respects, the only version of her that was real. She said that she had been used. She said this with a tremor in her voice that was at the precise boundary between controlled and breaking. Too much tremor would look affected, too little would look cold. And she had calibrated it with the precision of a woman who has spent 20 years knowing exactly how she appears. She said she had been surrounded by corrupt forces she had not fully understood, that she had accepted political support not knowing the source of it, that she was herself a victim of a network that had manipulated her and many others. She said she was cooperating with authorities. She said she was committed to the truth. She wiped her eye, once, with the back of her finger, in the way that suggests one is resisting tears rather than producing them. Some people believed her. This is the uncomfortable truth that no one in the case was quite prepared for. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some enough. Enough people for whom the sight of a powerful woman in apparent distress activated something sympathetic. Enough people who were, themselves, exhausted by cynicism and wanted to believe that recovery was possible, that someone caught in corruption could choose differently. Enough people who would become a political buffer for Drummond in the weeks ahead, buying her time and cover and the appearance of public goodwill. Nikki watched the press conference on her phone screen, propped against the steering wheel, parked on a side road in Kingston. She watched it with the full, concentrated attention she gave to things that were dangerous. She noted every word Drummond chose and every word she avoided. She noted the absence of any specific name, any specific accusation. The performance of vulnerability with no actual vulnerability in it, the armor of seeming unarmored. She put her phone down. She drove. That same afternoon, across the island, on minibuses moving between Kingston and Spanish Town, in the yards of Crescent Pen, at corner shops in communities from Portmore to Buff Bay, a different kind of message was being broadcast. Not a press conference. Not a radio interview. Something rawer and therefore more honest. The way music is always more honest than politics, because it has no need to pretend to be something other than what it feels. Cultural soundtrack. Blaze Machete's new track, Dem Sign Stop Y, dropped at noon on digital platforms and on a Kingston pirate radio station simultaneously, which suggested coordination of the deliberate and artful kind. The rhythm was hard, rolling, built on a bass line that shook the speakers in every vehicle it played in. The lyrics did not name anyone by name, but did not need to, because in Jamaica, in this moment, the people who needed naming had already been named by the community's own mouth, and the song was not an accusation but an anthem. A "We Are Still Here" of emphatic and defiant sound. People played it at the vigil outside New Jerusalem Tabernacle that evening, a small vigil, not yet the organized action that would follow. but a gathering of perhaps 40 people who brought candles and a portable speaker and stood on the public road in front of the church gate and sang along to Blaze Machete's chorus with the fervor of people who have found, in a piece of music, the precise shape of what they were already feeling. Tarek Powell was there with a clipboard, taking names. The community was not background. It was never background. It was the story. Carlton Vaz is found dead. The call came at 6:43 in the morning, on a day when the sky over Kingston was the color of lead and the air had the close, electric quality that precedes rain. Carlton Vaz had been found in his car, a dark green BMW, foreign-made, the kind of car that sits outside Kingston law offices the way prestige sits outside ambition. It was parked in his usual spot in the surface lot adjacent to his new Kingston office on Trafalgar Road. The car had been there since the previous evening, which his secretary noticed, but attributed to nothing in particular, as attorneys sometimes worked very late. She had arrived at 7:15 and noticed the car still there, and then noticed something in the quality of the stillness around it that caused her to walk closer rather than away. And what she found when she walked closer was something she would spend the rest of her life trying to find words adequate to describe and never quite succeeding. 2 shots to the head. Close range. The car door locked from the inside, which meant he had been in the car willingly, which meant he had either been ambushed when he entered it or had met someone there by arrangement. The latter was more likely, given the absence of any sign of struggle at the vehicle exterior. Carlton Vaz, Kingston attorney, architect of legal injunctions and public credibility campaigns and Delaware shell companies, had met someone in his car, and that someone had ended his life with the kind of precision that spoke of neither panic nor spontaneity. This was not grief-killing. This was not passion. This was operational. Nikki heard it from Claude in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and covered everything that needed covering. When she set the phone down, she sat very still for a moment with a specific feeling of the floor shifting beneath the case, not collapsing, but moving, the way tectonic things move when something has changed that cannot be changed back. Vaz's death told her several things simultaneously. It told her that someone above Levy had decided that Vaz was a risk, which meant Vaz knew something, or could be pressured into saying something, or had already said something that the network could not afford to have said. It told her that whoever had made this decision had the capacity to act on it quickly and cleanly in the middle of a city, in a parked car, with professional execution. It told her that the operation was not in retreat, it was pruning itself, making itself smaller, tighter, more survivable, eliminating the branches that might crack under pressure and pull the root with them. It also told her something about timelines. Operations that start eliminating their own operatives are operations that feel the net closing, which meant the net was real to them, which meant the pressure was working, which meant they needed to move faster. She called Claude back. She said, "We need to accelerate the Miami channel." Claude said she was already on it. The investigation's center of gravity had shifted. What had begun as a local case, a gun smuggling operation in a parish church, a corrupt superintendent, a councillor with dirty money, had opened into something with multiple floors above the one she'd entered through. The architect was not just a theory now. The architect was a presence demonstrated by violence, made real by absence, defined by what had just been done to Carlton Vaz in a locked car on Trafalgar Road at some point in the Kingston night. Levy goes quiet. Pastor Levy stopped appearing in public the same day that Vaz's body was found. This was noted, and it was noted as more alarming than his public appearances had been. Because the public Levy, the radio Levy, the Fitzroy interview Levy, was a man performing control. A man who believed, or wished to demonstrate that he believed, that the situation was manageable from his position. The silence of Levy was something different. The silence of Levy was a man who had received information that changed his calculation. His home in Crescent Pen had curtains drawn. The car that was usually in the driveway was gone. A woman who passed by, part of the informal observation network that Tariq's Crescent Pen Eyes had begun to organize, though they would not have used that language about themselves yet, reported that she had not seen lights in the house the night before. That the bins that were usually put out on Wednesday had not been put out. That the dog that usually barked from the backyard was not barking. Small details. The small details of a life being quietly packed up. Claude put a watch on him. Not an arrest, not yet, because the moment you move too soon on someone like Levy, someone who still has public sympathy and a Kingston lawyer, or had had one until last night, you risk collapsing the case. You need the case complete before you close the lid on it. Levy was watched. He was tracked. He was known to be somewhere in the country if not in his house. His silence was a form of communication. His silence said, I know what I know. I know what just happened to Carlton Boz. I know that the people above me consider the people below me to be expendable. His silence said, I am trying to decide whether to run before they decide that I too have become a liability, or whether to cooperate with the people trying to catch me before they do. It was the silence of a man weighing two kinds of danger and finding both of them very heavy indeed. Nikki found the financial thread connecting Vaza's murder to the broader network not through the murder investigation itself, but through a document that had been on the whiteboard for 3 days without her seeing its full implication. It was a Caribbean Sun freight invoice for a shipment whose declared value was $32,000 US, paid through a wire transfer from the Delaware holding company. The receiving account at the Jamaican end was a business account in the name of a property development company she had not previously focused on. She pulled the property company's registration. One of its 3 directors was Carlton Boz. One of the other 2 was a name she did not recognize. The third, the one listed as majority shareholder of a company that owned, among other things, a warehouse on the outskirts of May Pen, was listed under a corporate name, not a personal name, a corporate name, that resolved, through 3 subsequent company registry searches, to a single individual whose name appeared in no newspaper, no public record, no searchable database in any way connected to this case, but who appeared in the Kingston Commercial Register as the silent beneficial owner of a logistics and warehousing operation that had, in the past 4 years, received 14 inbound freight shipments from Caribbean Sun Freight LLC of Hialeah, Florida. She had a name. Not yet confirmed. Not yet provable in court. But a name. She wrote it at the top of the board next to the word architect and the question mark, and she looked at it for a long time, and the question mark remained, because a name is not yet evidence. A name is a direction. She was now moving in that direction with everything she had. While Nikki was staring at that name, New Jerusalem Tabernacle was coming apart from the inside. The Sunday service, conducted in Levy's absence by a junior deacon who looked as if he had been asked to perform surgery rather than a sermon, was attended by perhaps a third of the usual congregation. The rest had stayed home. Some had stayed home out of loyalty, wishing not to participate in what they saw as spectacle. Some had stayed home because they were ashamed or confused or both. Some had stayed home because they had simply, in the preceding week, been unable to come to a clear position and had resolved their uncertainty by resolving to go nowhere until they could. Of those who came, a number left before the service was finished. The deacon was midway through an announcement about the Wednesday prayer meeting when Mother Ivy stood up from her usual pew 4th row, center, the seat she had occupied for 46 years, gathered her church bag and her Bible and her coat, despite the heat, and walked with slow and absolute dignity down the center aisle and out the front door. She did not look at anyone as she left. She did not make a statement. She did not explain. The coat and the Bible and the steady pace of a woman who has made a decision that cost her something profound and is carrying the cost without flinching, these were statement enough. 6 other people rose and followed her. Not because they had arranged it, but because they recognized, in her gesture, the thing they themselves had been trying to find the language for, and they found, watching her walk, that the language was not necessary when you had her example. 7 people walking out of New Jerusalem Tabernacle in a file on a Sunday morning down the road in the direction of the sea. Behind them, the church they had helped to build. Before them, the uncertain territory of consequence. The deacon continued the announcement. But the room was different now, and everyone in it knew it. Fabe returns to the streets. He should not have been out of hospital yet. He was out of hospital anyway. Fabian Morris, cracked ribs, taped end cheekbones, still the color of a bruised mango, was walking the streets of a community adjacent to Crescent Pen 4 days after his discharge, which was itself 2 days before the doctor had wanted to discharge him. He was wearing civilian clothes and moving carefully, not slowly, not limping, but with a deliberateness that acknowledged his body's current limitations without being dictated by them. This was a distinction he had worked out in his own head and found useful. He was following a thread that connected to Devon Hilton by way of someone who had worked for a freight company in Kingston that had handled Caribbean Sun freight packages at the local distribution end. This was the kind of slow, tedious, profoundly unglamorous investigative work that doesn't make it into crime dramas because it consists mostly of conversations in which nothing useful is said, followed by more conversations in which nothing useful is almost said, followed by one conversation in which something small but significant emerges, like a splinter working its way to the surface. The splinter Fabe found was a warehouse worker named Aldrich, who had worked briefly at the Kingston end of a distribution chain, who had signed for 2 packages bearing Caribbean Sun freight markings that were heavier than their manifests claimed, who had been told to put them in a specific area of the warehouse and not discuss them, and who had, for reasons he summarized only as "me conscience start bother me one night when me remember what me know," been keeping a photograph of the manifest on his phone for 11 months, not knowing what to do with it, carrying it like a debt he didn't know how to pay. Fabe took the photograph. He thanked Aldrich with the careful, unceremonious sincerity of a man who understands that witnesses who act from conscience deserve not to be made to feel foolish for it. He sent the photograph to Nikki with a single accompanying message, "Still in the game." Nikki, looking at her phone in the ACU borrowed office, allowed herself a brief, private smile that she then put away and returned to the work at hand. Drummond's private message arrived that same evening. Not through any official channel. Through an intermediary, a text sent to a number that Nikki recognized as belonging to a journalist she knew, forwarded from a number that traced to a prepaid phone registered at a Kingston convenience store. The message was 23 words. It said that Drummond had information about the structure above Levy that she was willing to share under the right conditions, and that those conditions did not include formal cooperation with law enforcement, but did include assurances of a kind that she would not specify in a text message. It was an offer. It was a warning. It was both at once, in the way that all communication from someone like Drummond was always both at once. Nikki did not reply that night. She set the phone face down on the desk and stared at the ceiling of the borrowed office for a long time, thinking through the implications of every possible response, including no response at all. She came home to find the door unlocked. Not broken. Not forced. Unlocked, in the way a door is unlocked when someone who knows how to unlock it has been through it and left again, and left it unlocked as a message rather than through carelessness, because carelessness was not the quality of the people who had done this. Nikki stood in the doorway of her apartment in Portmore for a full 30 seconds before she went in. And in those 30 seconds, she noted the door and processed its implications and made a series of rapid internal assessments about risk and procedure and what to do next. And then she went in with her weapon out and her senses at full extension, moving through her own home with the heightened alertness of someone for whom home has just become a different kind of space. No one was there. They had come and gone. They had been through her things with professionalism, not ransacking but searching, and the difference is visible if you know your own space well enough, which Nikki did. A drawer not quite closed all the way. A book on the shelf that she always kept spine outward now turned slightly inward. Her files, she kept paper files at home, encrypted USB copies also. The paranoia of a woman who knew what systems were capable of losing had been gone through and replaced with the slight wrongness of things that have been handled and put back almost correctly. The note was on the kitchen table. Printed, not handwritten, because handwriting is traceable in ways that printing is not. 4 sentences. They told her that she had come far enough. They told her that the people she was working against were not the kind of people who issue multiple warnings. They told her that she had a family, which was interesting, because she didn't, not really, not in the conventional sense, unless they meant, and then the last sentence told her. They meant her brother. The brother whose photograph was in a frame on the shelf in her bedroom. The brother she had not seen in 2 years. The brother whose location she would have said no one knew. She set the note down. She sat at the kitchen table. The apartment was very still. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood at night, a television through the wall, a dog somewhere, the distant rhythm of music from the road. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a world that did not know what was happening in this kitchen. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. This is not because she was not affected. She was deeply, profoundly affected, in ways that moved through her slowly like something geological, like the kind of feeling that takes days to fully arrive. But she had been doing this long enough to know that the purpose of this kind of intimidation was not only to frighten, but to isolate, to make you feel that the cost of continuing is borne by you alone, that you are standing in a place no one else can see or reach. That the only rational response is to step back into the light of the ordinary and abandon the thing you are trying to do. She understood this. She understood it well enough to refuse it with the same clear-eyed deliberateness with which she had refused everything else they had thrown at her. She picked up the note and put it in an evidence bag because it was evidence. She called the forensics line and reported the entry. She called a locksmith for the door. And then she went and stood on the balcony of her apartment and looked out at the Kingston night, the lights scattered on the hillsides, the dark shape of the harbor in the distance, the particular, beautiful, complex city that had made her and that she was trying, at some cost, to protect. She picked up the photograph of her brother from the shelf. He was 28 in the photograph, 2 years younger than she was now. He was laughing, looking at something off camera, the laugh of someone who doesn't know they're being photographed and is therefore fully themselves. She looked at the photograph. She set it back on the shelf, face up this time, and then face down, and then face up again. She left it face up. She went to bed at 2 in the morning. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Marcus goes viral. It was Tariq who had the idea, though he would later say it was Marcus's words that made it possible and Kezia's courage that made it necessary. He set up his phone on a stack of books in Desmond's yard on a Saturday afternoon, aimed the camera at Marcus, and said, "Just talk. Talk the way you talked before. Don't think about the camera. Think about the people." Marcus Tafari sat in a wooden chair in the afternoon light, his locks resting on his shoulders, his hands on his knees, and he talked. He talked for 11 minutes and 42 seconds. He spoke about being taken from his farm in the early morning, about the confusion of a man who has done nothing, finding himself in a system designed to process the assumption of guilt. He spoke about Kezia and what it meant to him that she had stood up. He spoke, carefully and specifically, about the speaker boxes, about the church, about a community whose trust had been weaponized against it. He spoke without anger and without self-pity and without performance, which is to say he spoke in the way that very few people on camera speak, and which is why, When Tarek posted the video at 8 o'clock that Saturday evening with the caption "Crescent Pen Man Speak the Truth" and a link to a petition demanding a full independent inquiry, the video moved through Jamaican social media with the velocity of something that has been needed without being named, that fills a shape already formed in the public consciousness. By midnight it had 60,000 views. By Sunday morning it had 240,000. By Sunday evening it had been shared into Trinidad, into Barbados, into the Jamaican diaspora communities of London and Toronto and Miami and New York, where Jamaicans watched it and shared it with the particular pride and pain of people who love a country from a distance and feel its troubles as both close and unreachable. By Tuesday, it had been picked up by 3 national media outlets, and a clip of Marcus speaking about being framed was playing on television screens in waiting rooms and bars and living rooms across the island. The community erupted. Not in violence, though the tension was present, as it always is in communities that have been wronged and are still in the process of determining what justice looks like when it arrives slowly. But in sound and presence and the organized, persistent assertion of the community's own account of what was happening, the community's refusal to be represented only by those who had wronged it. Tarek's Crescent Pen Eyes group went from a name on a clipboard to a functioning organization in the space of 72 hours. By the following Thursday, they had a WhatsApp group with 134 members, rota of people committed to observing and reporting anything unusual in the district, and a standing arrangement to meet every Sunday evening in Desmond's yard. Tarek himself was changed by it, not transformed, because transformation implies that what was there before was insufficient, and it was not insufficient, it was simply waiting for the right moment of use. He was the same person he had been, with the same complicated history and the same carefully constructed relationship with his own conscience. But he was that person now at the center of something, with the particular weight of being needed pressing on him in a way that he was learning to carry with both hands. Claude opens the international channel. The joint operation request went to the Miami field office of a U.S. federal law enforcement agency through the formal channel that the ACU had established 2 years prior for exactly this kind of case. The kind of case that respects no coastline and no border and operates in the gap between what any single jurisdiction can see. It contained everything Nikki and Claude had built, the company records, the manifest discrepancy, the Delaware holding structure, the Kingston warehouse data that Fabe's warehouse worker had provided, the freight invoice with the payment trail, and a detailed financial analysis that Claude had put together herself over 36 hours of concentrated work that included, by her own count, 1 meal and approximately 4 hours of sleep. The Miami office responded within 12 hours. This was fast, which was itself information. It meant they either already had Devin Hilton on their radar from another angle, or that what they'd been sent was compelling enough to create urgency, or both. The response was a request for a video call, which Claude and Nikki took together in the secure room of the ACU office, sitting across a table from a screen on which 2 federal agents, a man and a woman, both of them with the specific kind of professional composure that international law enforcement cultivates as a matter of institutional necessity, went through the documents page by page. The Miami agents knew Caribbean Sun Freight. They had known it was of interest for approximately 14 months as part of a broader investigation into freight-based trafficking through South Florida. They had not moved on it yet because they did not yet have the Jamaican end of the chain, which is to say they had the logistics company but not the destination network. And without the destination network, the prosecution falls apart because you are moving contraband from somewhere to nowhere and no court accepts that geography. Nikki and Claude had given them the nowhere. The joint operation framework was established that afternoon. Devin Hilton would be placed under active federal surveillance in Miami. His accounts, his communications, his movements, all of it. The operation would move when both sides were ready to move simultaneously, when the arrest in Miami and the arrests in Jamaica could happen close enough together that one could not warn the other. It was the thing the architect had not expected, that the investigation would reach across water. That two women in a borrowed ACU office would build a chain from a Crescent Pen church to a Hialeah freight company and then invite the people in Florida to take hold of their end of it. The net was real now, on both sides of the ocean. Kezia asks the question. Kezia had been moved to a new location. She was safe, in a space that was more carefully arranged than Miss Eula's house, with people who understood the stakes and took them seriously. She had been given, among other things, a notebook and some pens, because Nikki had learned, in the brief time she had known this girl, that Kezia wrote when she couldn't speak and spoke when she'd finished writing, and that both forms of expression were important to her and ought to be respected. Nikki came to see her on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the incident at Miss Eula's house. Kezia was sitting at a table with the notebook open and a pen in her hand, and she looked up when Nikki came in with the expression of someone emerging from a thought that is still partially holding her. She looked better than she had. Not fine would have been a lie, and Kezia did not deal in lies. It was the specific quality that had brought her to this situation and simultaneously made her indispensable to its resolution. But better. Steadier. Something in her eyes that was not the haunted quality of the days immediately following her testimony, but rather the complicated, forward-looking thing that comes when a person has understood what they have survived and is beginning to orient themselves toward what comes next. They talked for a while about ordinary things about Marcus, who had spoken to Kezia by video call every other day and who was maintaining his public presence with the calm consistency of a man who has made peace with the cost of doing so. About the food at this location, which Kezia assessed with the frank culinary honesty of a Jamaican who had opinions. About the notebook, which Kezia held against her chest briefly before setting it aside. And then Kezia asked her question. She said it the way young people sometimes say the things they have been thinking for a long time, not with preamble, not with careful setup, but directly, as if the thought has simply arrived at the front of the queue and she is not going to make it wait any longer. She asked, "Who is going to protect us when you're done?" The us. Not just herself, the us of this community, the us of the people who had testified, the us of the people who had stepped forward, who had given information, who had walked out of churches, who had stood at vigils with candles, who had been made targets by the simple act of choosing honesty in a situation where honesty was dangerous. Who was going to protect them when the investigation concluded, when the ACU moved on to the next case, when Nikki was deployed elsewhere, when the attention that currently provided a degree of cover moved on, as attention always does? Nikki did not answer immediately. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. She thought about the legal mechanisms, witness protection, community policing initiatives, the slow institutional machinery of post-investigation support. She thought about Tariq and the Crescent Pen Eyes and what that organization might become if given the right support and the right time to grow. She thought about Mother Ivy walking out of that church and what it had meant to the people who had watched her walk. She thought about what communities do when they have been through something that has stripped away certain illusions. Sometimes they collapse, and sometimes they harden into something that can withstand the next thing and the thing after that. She said, "You will protect yourselves. You already started. But I'm not done yet, either." Kezia looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not because she was entirely satisfied with the answer. She was too honest for false satisfaction, but because she recognized that it was the truest answer available, and she had long since made her accommodation with truth over comfort. Devo Falls in Miami. The arrest of Devin Devo Hilton happened at 6:41 in the morning, Miami time, on a Thursday. He was taken at his home in Doral, a suburb that sits west of the city with a large Caribbean population and the particular quality of a place that has absorbed so many identities that it has developed one of its own, not American, not Caribbean, but both in conversation and negotiation. He was at the kitchen table when the agents came through the door, which he had left unlocked because he expected a different kind of early morning visitor. He did not run. He was, in this final moment, the same man he had always been, someone who had built careful systems and who had, in his systematic way, made the calculation that running was less productive than compliance, at least at this stage. He would find a lawyer. He would manage this. Or he believed he would. Claude got the confirmation text from the Miami Federal contact at 6:47 Jamaican time, which was 6:47 on the same morning because the time zones aligned in this moment as they did not always align in this work. She called Nikki immediately. Nikki was already awake, had been awake since 4, which was becoming a pattern in this case, the case that did not permit full sleep. Hilton is in custody, Claude said. 2 words of news. 4 words of implication. Nikki said, then Levy knows. Or he will know within the hour. Claude said, then we move now. Information travels in certain criminal networks with the speed of the specific dread that comes from knowing what an arrest means for the person after the arrested one in the chain. Levy would know, or people close to Levy would know, that Devo's arrest meant the American end of the operation was collapsed, which meant that the Jamaican end was now fully exposed from above, which meant that Levy had no more cover. No more Miami logistics to hide the trail through. No more Delaware shell companies to absorb the scrutiny. He was exposed. He was also, Nikki calculated, in the specific danger of being someone the architect might now consider equally expendable as Carlton Boz. Levy's choice had just narrowed to 2 options. Run to a place he could not be reached. Or run toward something he hoped could protect him. They had 48 hours, at most, before one of those choices was made. Fabe's full loyalty. The call to Fabe went out at 7 in the morning. He was already on the road because Fabe had also been awake since early, not because he had been informed about the Miami arrest, but because he had been sitting with a decision that he needed to tell Nikki about before the day moved too far forward. The man who had sent the photograph of his mother, Fabe, had, through the careful and persistent work of someone who has been made angry in a productive direction, managed to identify him. Not by name yet, but by face, by neighborhood, by the pattern of his movements. This man had approached him again, not with a photograph this time, but with a direct communication, through an intermediary, that told Fabe that his mother's safety was guaranteed if he provided certain information about the ACU investigation. Specifically, about Claude and about the Miami operation. This was an intelligence operation targeting Nikki and Claude through Fabe. Someone above Levy had identified him as a potential weak point. And they were not wrong to identify him as a vulnerability. His mother was real. Her exposure was real. The love that made that exposure a lever was real. They were only wrong about what he would do with it. He met Nikki at a coffee shop at 7:45. Not the ACU office, neutral ground, nothing that could be watched. He sat down and he told her everything. The intermediary's name, the specific information requested, the timeline he had been given to respond. He told her with the straight, clear delivery of a man who has been through the part of the decision that is difficult and is now in the part that is simply execution. He said, me not giving them anything. I want you to use this. Use the intermediary to feed them false information. Controlled. Whatever you and Claude think is useful. Whatever slows them down or gives us time. Nikki looked at him across the coffee shop table, the healing face, the clear eyes, the full commitment made without melodrama. She thought of the young man she had been partnered with 2 years ago, fresh-faced and eager, and still figuring out what kind of officer he wanted to be in a system that was not always kind to the kind of officer she was hoping he'd become. She said yes. She said she would arrange the protection for his mother that they had discussed in the hospital room. She said that what he was offering, the use of himself as a controlled conduit of false information, was the kind of tactic that carried risk and required courage, and that she would understand if he changed his mind at any point. He said, "Me not going to change me mind, Nikki. That part done." She called Claude from the car park. She laid out the plan. Claude was quiet for 2 seconds, and then said that it was good, that it was very good, and that they would use it carefully and immediately. The false information Fabe would feed the intermediary would be designed to make the architect's people believe that the ACU was 48 hours further behind than they actually were. It would buy time. It would also, if the intermediary relayed it quickly, tell them something about how rapidly information moved from street level to wherever the architect was sitting. Every piece of the operation had its function now. Every person, every thread. The net was drawing tight. The dark road and Levy in chains. The intelligence came from Mother Ivy, indirectly, through a chain of 3 people, each of whom knew only the piece they were carrying. Levy had gone to a property in the hills of St. Thomas Parish, a rural community 7 hours' drive from Kingston along roads that were only partially paved and that were, after a certain point, navigable only by someone who knew them. The property was in the name of a relative, not Levy himself, a cousin who lived in England and who had never, to public knowledge, had any connection to Conrad Levy beyond blood. Nikki and Fabe drove through the night. Claude had a second unit coordinating through a different approach road, holding back. The goal was to intercept, not to create a situation that required a siege. Because a siege on a rural property creates its own pressures and its own dangers, and Nikki wanted Levy alive and talking. The road was dark in the specific way that rural Jamaican roads are dark, no streetlights, the canopy of trees overhead blocking the moon, the headlights finding the road in sections like a story told in pieces. The blue mountains were invisible in the night, but present, vast and enormous and patient in the way that very old things are patient, the way that things which do not need human time in order to endure are patient. The smell through the car window was night-blooming things and wood rot and the particular cleanness of high altitude after recent rain. Fabe sat in the passenger seat with his ribs taped and his hands loose in his lap, not gripping the door or the seat, which Nikki noticed and appreciated. They drove mostly in silence, the way people who understand each other drive when they are moving toward something that requires all the focus that conversation would spend. Occasionally one of them said something brief and necessary. Otherwise, the road and the dark and the mountains and the certainty, building with each mile of what they were driving toward. They found the vehicle first. A dark-colored SUV, nose first into a gap in the tree line at the side of the road, as if parked in a hurry, or as if someone had pulled over to think and had been there thinking for a while. The engine was cold. Levy was 30 meters further along the road on foot, moving toward a track that led up into the hills, carrying a bag on each shoulder. He was moving fast for a man of his age and build, but not fast enough for the road or the dark, both of which were against him in ways he had not fully accounted for when he made the decision to run on foot from a vehicle that could no longer be driven without attracting attention. Nikki called out to him. Her voice on that silent road at that hour had the quality of a thing that has been building for a long time and is finally, simply released, no performance, no drama, just the firm and irresistible sound of authority that has earned itself. He stopped. He turned. In the beam of the car headlights, Conrad Levy, pastor of New Jerusalem Tabernacle, enforcer of a gun-smuggling network, man who had preached love and practiced otherwise, community patriarch and professional deceiver, looked at Nikki Campbell. And something happened in his face that was the collapse of the performance. Not guilt, exactly. People like Levy do not collapse into guilt the way ordinary people imagine they might. But the exhaustion of performance, the dropping of the face he had maintained for years and years, the simple, animal, exhausted recognition that it was over. He set the bags down. He put his hands up. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man choosing how to be seen in his final performance, because even in surrender, the impulse for control. The confrontation that followed was not loud. It was not physical in the way that confrontations in stories sometimes are. It was terse and precise and bounded by law and by the understanding that both parties had of what was happening and what it meant. Fabe cuffed him. Nikki read his rights in the clear, steady voice of someone for whom this moment, awaited for a long time, had finally arrived and did not require celebration or amplification. Levy was quiet for a long time. Then, in the car, with Nikki in the front and Fabe beside him in the back, he spoke. He said he wanted to talk. He said he wanted assurances, which Nikki told him she could not give, but that any cooperation would be noted. He said that the people above him were not people who would let him sit in a cell without deciding that a cell was too close to a courthouse. He said he was, in his own particular assessment of the situation, safer in police custody than out of it now that Boz was dead, which was either a genuine realization or the most tactical thing he had said in this entire affair. And Nikki suspected it was both simultaneously. He said, "You know the name above mine. You have to. You're too close not to." Nikki said nothing. She looked at the road. He said, "The architect. You know who that is." And then he said a name. One name. Nikki's hands on the steering wheel did not tighten, but her breathing changed, fractionally, in the way that breathing changes when something you suspected and didn't want to be right has just been confirmed. The name was a name she knew. A name that existed not in the criminal register, but in a different kind of register entirely. A name that explained things she had been unable to explain and that opened, by being spoken, a new and much larger set of things that she now needed to understand. She did not repeat it aloud. She would give it to Claude. Claude would verify it. They would build the case around it the way they had built every part of this case, carefully, methodically, with evidence rather than assumption, with patience rather than haste. But the name was now in the car in the night, on that dark road between the mountains, and it changed the weight of everything. She drove. Levy went quiet. He would not say it again. He had said it once, and once was enough, and both of them knew it. Standing in the rain. Rain came to Kingston the way rain comes sometimes, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the sky simply opening. It was just past 3 in the morning when Levy was processed and placed in custody. The rain had been falling for 20 minutes by then, had turned the streets outside the station into something reflective and indistinct, the lights of the building shimmering in the puddles on the road, the sound of it on the roof a constant, democratic percussion. Nikki stood outside. She had been inside for 3 hours and she needed, in the way that people who have been through something that has compressed time and urgency and high-stakes decision-making into a single extended experience, to stand somewhere that was simply outside, where the air was moving and the rain was real and falling on her without caring who she was or what she had done. Claude came out and stood beside her. Not the side exactly, at an angle, the way two people stand when they are both looking at the same horizon rather than at each other. The rain came down on them both. Neither of them moved to get out of it. They had not yet spoken about the name. That would come tomorrow, in daylight, in the ACU office with the secure terminal and the whiteboard and the careful, systematic work of verification. Tonight was not the night for that conversation. Tonight was the rain and the name hanging between them like smoke that neither of them reached out to dissipate. Claude said, finally, quietly, facing the rain, "If that name is real," and then she stopped. Not because she didn't have the rest of the sentence. Because the rest of the sentence was a doorway into the magnitude of what it would mean, and neither of them was quite ready, in this moment, to step through it. Nikki said, "It's real." Another silence. The rain. A taxi going past on the road, its windshield wipers working. The distant sound of a radio somewhere. Someone awake at this hour, music playing softly in the direction of the sea. Fabe came out a minute later, jacket pulled over his head as a gesture toward the rain that acknowledged it without quite conceding to it. He stood on the other side of Nikki, completing the three of them on the wet pavement in front of the station, and he looked at them both and understood from their faces that something large had shifted, though he did not yet know what. He didn't ask. He was learning, in this work, when questions were for now and when they were for morning. Inside the station, Pastor Conrad Levy sat in a holding room with his hands on the table and his eyes on the wall, and whatever he was thinking in that room was between him and the God he had purported to serve, and possibly between him and the people above him who were now, certainly, aware that he had been taken, and who were somewhere in a Kingston building, or a parish office, or a room with a view of the harbor, or perhaps further away than any of them imagined, in a place where power accumulates so much of itself that it believes itself to be beyond the kind of evening out that Detective Corporal Nikki Campbell was moving toward with the slow, implacable momentum of someone who has decided that this case ends on her terms. In Crescent Pen, in the blue-black hours before dawn, a rooster crowed from a yard behind the road. A light came on in a house where someone was beginning their day early or had not yet ended the previous one. The gate of New Jerusalem Tabernacle was still padlocked, still bearing the sign that said God is love in letters that the rain was beginning to weather. Somewhere in the hills above Crescent Pen, on a farm that had survived being used as evidence of nothing, Brother Marcus Tafari was awake. He was always awake before light, had always risen before the world fully demanded he do so, because he understood that the morning belongs to those who meet it rather than those who wait for it to arrive. He was making tea. He was listening to the rain. He was thinking about Kezia, who was safe. He was thinking about what comes next, which was a question he had been taught, by the particular curriculum of his life, to hold without needing to immediately answer. Kezia, in her protected location, was awake too. She had her notebook. She was writing. What she was writing was not yet known to anyone else, and perhaps that was as it should be. Some things belong first to the person who survived the experience before they belong to the record. But she was writing, which meant she was processing, which meant she was not done, which meant that the 19-year-old who had stood up and told the truth was still standing. Still telling. Tarek Powell was asleep, finally, after a day that had included 3 WhatsApp group meetings, a radio interview he had not expected and handled better than he expected, and a conversation with his mother in which she told him she was proud of him, and he did not know quite what to do with that, but held it carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile, unsure yet of its full weight. He would dream, this night, of his younger self and wake from it not frightened but thoughtful, in the way that people wake when their dreams are not escaping them, but catching up. Mother Ivy slept. She had prayed before bed, as she always did, not for specific outcomes, because she had long since given up the idea that prayer was a mechanism for controlling results. She prayed the way she had always prayed, which was to say she simply stood before whatever she believed in and said, "Here I am, and here is what happened, and I am still here." This seemed to her sufficient. It always had. And in the parking lot of the ACU station, the rain fell on Nikki and Claude and Fabe, 3 figures in the Kingston night, and none of them moved. This is what we know when the rain is falling and the night is deep and the city is doing what cities do, carrying its million lives forward without pause, without apology, without waiting for any one story to resolve itself before the next one begins. We know that a name has been spoken in the backseat of a police car on a dark road in the mountains, and that name is now loose in the world, and the world does not yet know what to do with it, but is about to find out. We know that a man called Levy is in custody, and a man called Hilton is in custody in another country, and a man called Bent is in custody and still not talking, and a man called Boz is dead. And somewhere the person who is the reason for all of these things is still free, still unreachable, still the summit of a structure that is losing its base and its middle, but not yet its top. Not yet. We know that Nikki Campbell is still standing, that she has been searched, warned, isolated, threatened through the people she loves, and is still standing. That this is not merely stubbornness, though it is partly stubbornness, and stubbornness is underrated in the fight against people who rely on others wearing down. It is something more than stubbornness. It is the particular, clear-eyed decision to be the person who does not look away, not because looking away is impossible, but because she has decided it is not, for her, allowable. We know that a community is still here, still watching, still naming its experience in music and in vigils and in notebooks and in the quiet, dignified walk of an old woman down a church aisle. The community is never background. The community is always the story. Because the people of Crescent Pen and the people of every district like it, from here to the ends of this island, are not the set dressing of someone else's drama. They're the people to whom all of this actually happens. The guns were not aimed at abstractions. The corruption was not theoretical. The harm was done to real bodies and real lives and real trust. And the resistance is equally real, equally bodied, equally present. They say in Jamaica, every day bucket go a well, one day deep bottom drop out. Every day the bucket goes to the well, one day the bottom falls out. Every corrupt system, every carefully maintained network of fear and silence and complicity carries within it the day when it cannot hold anymore. The architect is still up there, unnamed in the public record, still pulling strings on the structure below. But the structure below is gone now. One by one, the pieces are gone. What is left is the roof with no walls. What is left is a name in a car on a dark road. What is left is Nikki, still in the rain, still not going inside, still looking at the street and the reflection of the lights in the puddles, and the name turning over in her mind the way a stone turns in running water. Smoothed and smoothed until its edges are gone and its truth is just its truth and nothing else. This island of sun and shadow. This Jamaica. This place where the blue mountains hold the clouds and the sea holds the memory of everything that ever came to these shores, willing and unwilling, and the land itself seems sometimes to be watching, seems sometimes to be waiting, seems to know something about justice that the law has not yet fully articulated. Babylon was still burning. But you know what they say about fire in this part of the world. It does not only destroy. Sometimes it purifies. Sometimes it is the only thing left bright enough to see by when everything that was hiding in the dark finally has to stand in the light. Episode 3 is coming. The architect has a face. And Nikki Campbell is going to find it. End of episode 2.